Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that the Homestead Act, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln on May 20th, 1862, gave immigrants, women, and slaves chances to own land for the first time? Learn how homesteaders received 160 acres of land for a small fee, while settlers paid $10 to file a claim and later bought land for just $1.25 per acre, while Union soldiers counted their service as payment to live on the land. Discover that homesteaders found it very difficult to live on the land because of harsh weather, insects that destroyed crops, and living isolated from others for long periods of time. Discover that by 1900, homesteaders had filed 600,000 claims for 80 million acres of land, but only 3 out of every 5 homesteaders stayed on their land. Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine for a second the government today just offering you a massive, fully funded tech startup.
Right.
Or, a prime piece of highly desirable real estate. And all they ask for in return is a $10 processing fee. Just $10.
Which is basically nothing.
Right, nothing. But there's a massive catch. To keep this asset, you have to pack up your entire life, move to a completely hostile environment, and survive totally off the grid for 5 solid years.
It's just the ultimate high-stakes gamble. I mean, you have no infrastructure out there, no guarantee of success whatsoever, and...
It's a piece of paper.
Exactly. Just a piece of paper saying you have the legal right to try.
So our mission for today's deep dive is to really dig into the Homestead Act of 1862 and that whole broader era of westward expansion.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It really is. We're looking at how this seemingly simple offer of 160 acres of quote-unquote free land fundamentally reshaped the United States.
Right.
Because it's a policy that provided this absolutely unprecedented opportunity for hundreds of thousands of people. But, and as we're going to explore, it simultaneously extracted a devastating permanent price from others.
Yeah, the duality of it is intense.
Very. We're talking about, a brutal 60% failure rate, literal swarms of crop-eating grasshoppers, and a complex legal legacy that remarkably lasted all the way up until 1988.
Which is just an astonishing timeline when you think about it. You have a single piece of legislation signed during the Civil War that sets off this chain reaction, right?
Yeah.
And it alters the physical landscape, the economy, the demographic makeup of an entire continent for over a century.
So let's start with the actual mechanics of the deal itself. President Abraham Lincoln signs the Homestead Act into law on May 20th, 1862.
Right in the thick of the American Civil War.
Exactly, which is a detail we really cannot gloss over. But a year earlier, on July 4th, 1861, Lincoln actually laid out the philosophical vision for this. He stated that the goal of his policies was, and I quote, "to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial burdens from all shoulders, and to give everyone an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life."
And, legally speaking, the act was just exceptionally broad for its era to try and actually accomplish that vision.
How so? Like, mechanically, what did it look like?
Well, the basic requirements were pretty straightforward. You pay that $10 filing fee. You had to be at least 21 years old. And you have to remain on those 160 acres of public land continuously for 5 years.
Okay, so that's the catch.
Right. But the most radical component wasn't the timeline. It was who was actually allowed to apply. It was open to essentially any citizen or intended citizen.
Meaning, like, poor families, freed slaves, women, and new immigrants, they all suddenly had this legal pathway to claim land.
Exactly.
Which is a massive demographic shift for the 1860s. And there were a couple of fascinating exceptions built into the fine print, right?
Yeah, so Union soldiers, for instance, they were allowed to deduct the time they served in the Civil War from that required 5-year residency.
Oh, that's a nice perk.
Yeah. And alternatively, if a settler got out there and decided they didn't want to sweat out the full 5 years, they could actually buy the land outright after just 6 months.
For how much?
For $1.25 per acre.
Wow. Okay, so that provides a built-in fast track for anyone who brought, a little capital with them to the frontier.
Precisely.
But I do want to push back a bit on the premise of this being an unfettered start, because a $10 filing fee is undeniably cheap. For 160 acres, sure.
Oh, absolutely.
But uprooting your entire family, buying a wagon, the oxen, all the supplies and tools just to farm completely untamed land. I mean, that is a massive financial barrier, isn't it?
It is.
So was this actually democratizing land ownership, or was it just, I don't know, a different flavor of an exclusionary system?
Well, it actually did democratize the acquisition process, but you have to look at it primarily because of what it replaced.
Okay, what was the old system?
Prior to 1862, the federal government's main method of getting rid of public land was selling it in these massive, super expensive blocks.
Oh, I see.
And the only people who could afford those blocks were wealthy Eastern speculators. They would buy up huge swaths of the West and then just sit on it and eventually charge exorbitant prices to poor farmers.
Just flipping the land.
Exactly. So the Homestead Act bypassed those speculators entirely. It basically removed the middleman, offering the dirt directly to the people who were actually willing to work it.
Okay, that makes sense. It changes the initial barrier from just pure wealth to, sheer labor.
Right.
But you mentioned the Civil War timing earlier. I have to imagine Lincoln wasn't just doing this out of pure altruism, right?
Oh, definitely not. It was a highly calculated piece of statecraft.
Because of the Confederates.
Yeah. By offering this land during the war, the Union was actively incentivizing loyal citizens, and they explicitly excluded Confederates from this to go populate the Great Plains.
Wow. So it was strategic.
Highly strategic. The goal was to secure those Western territories for the Union and rapidly build up this massive agricultural base that could support the war effort and also feed the industrializing East.
So it's essentially nation building disguised as a real estate giveaway.
That's a great way to put it.
But, getting the deed on paper was clearly the easy part. The actual trial was surviving the land itself. We mentioned a 60% failure rate earlier in the deep dive.
Yeah, the number got grim.
Mechanically, how does a supposedly foolproof land giveaway fail that spectacularly? 3 out of 5 people just quit.
It fails because the entire policy was built on, honestly, a fundamental misunderstanding of ecology.
Really? How so?
The government essentially took an Eastern farming model and just copy-pasted it right onto the Great Plains.
Meaning the plot size, the 160 acres.
Exactly. On the East Coast or, in Western Europe where you have abundant, really reliable rainfall, 160 acres is a massive, highly productive farm. But the Great Plains is a semi-arid environment. These settlers were moving into present-day Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming. Out there, the rainfall is sporadic at best.
Right.
So to grow crops without modern irrigation, you have to practice something called dry farming.
Wait, how does that actually work in practice? Like, if it's not raining, how are you growing corn?
Right, it sounds impossible. Dry farming relies on maximizing and preserving whatever residual moisture is already trapped deep down in the soil.
Okay.
So you have to plow incredibly deep.
Yeah.
And crucially, you often have to leave half of your land fallow, meaning totally unplanted every single year.
Really? Just empty?
Yeah, just to let it absorb and store enough moisture from the snow and whatever rain does fall so you can use it for the next season.
Oh, wow. So immediately, your 160-acre farm is effectively only an 80-acre farm because half of it is always just resting.
Precisely. And suddenly 160 acres just isn't enough land to yield a profitable crop through dry farming.
It's a math problem.
It is. But at the exact same time, because the prairie sod was so incredibly dense and just brutally difficult to break, 160 acres was way too much land for a single family to plow and manage by hand.
Oh, man. So you're trapped.
You're trapped in a geographical paradox. Unless you were wealthy enough to go into heavy debt for those expensive mechanical tractors and reapers, you're stuck.
You have too much land to work, but somehow not enough land to actually make a living.
Exactly.
And if the math doesn't ruin you, I mean, the environment definitely will.
These families were facing extreme weather.
Oh, brutal weather.
Blizzards in the winter, scorching droughts in the summer. And they were isolated, living miles apart from their nearest neighbors with zero community infrastructure.
No schools, no doctors, nothing.
Right. And then there's the detail that just feels almost biblical to me, the grasshoppers.
Oh, the Rocky Mountain locusts.
Yes.
They're an extinct species now, thankfully. But during the homesteading era, they formed these swarms that would literally block out the sun. The accounts of this are horrifying. You read about people spending months breaking that dense prairie sod by hand, planting your corn, praying for rain. And right as your crop finally comes up, a swarm descends and consumes your entire livelihood in an afternoon. I mean, they ate crops, they ate the wool right off live sheep.
It's crazy.
They even ate the wooden handles off the pitchforks.
Yeah, it sounds like an exaggeration, but it's totally true. And when you combine that level of ecological hostility with the profound psychological toll of the isolation.
Right.
That 60% failure rate doesn't just make sense, it feels almost inevitable. By 1900, settlers had filed 600,000 claims covering 80 million acres.
80 mil.
80 million. That means 3 out of every 5 families who went out there packed up and left before their 5 years were even up.
It really shatters that romanticized image of, the rugged pioneer conquering the frontier. They weren't just defeated by bad luck. They were defeated by a system that asked them to do the impossible. But while the individual family corn farmers were failing by the hundreds of thousands, the broader economy of the West was actually booming, wasn't it?
It was, and that was thanks entirely to the railroads. The arrival of the railroads completely shifted the economic reality of the Great Plains.
It fixed the isolation.
And it solved the isolation problem, yeah, but definitely not in the way the homesteaders had hoped.
I look at the railroad in this era almost like laying down the first high-speed fiber optic cables for the internet.
That's a good analogy.
Because before the railroad, if you had a resource in the middle of Wyoming, it was basically worthless because you couldn't get it to a consumer.
Exactly.
The moment the tracks are laid, you suddenly have a direct pipeline to the East Coast markets. But the people who capitalized on this new pipeline weren't the struggling corn farmers, right? It was the cattle ranchers.
Yeah, because cattle were the perfect asset for this specific ecology. You don't have to plow the dense prairie sod to raise cattle.
They just eat the grass.
They just eat the tough native grasses.
Yeah.
And unlike corn, cattle are a mobile commodity. You can literally just walk them to the railhead.
And the numbers highlight just how massive this shift was. Between 1860 and 1880, the cattle population on the Great Plains exploded from 130,000 to 4.5 million.
It's a staggering increase.
And all of this was driven by a skyrocketing demand for beef in the rapidly growing eastern cities.
And this is where the reality completely diverges from Lincoln's ideal, right?
How so?
Well, the vision was millions of small, independent family farms covering the continent. But the ecology of the plains, combined with the economics of the railroad, meant the region rapidly consolidated into massive commercial cattle operations.
So the little guy gets pushed out.
Exactly. The lone homesteader was essentially starved out, while corporate agriculture and ranching took over.
But wait, we're talking about allocating 80 million acres of land for farms and millions of cattle roaming the plains.
Yeah.
You cannot just give away an entire region of a continent unless it is empty. And the Great Plains were absolutely not empty.
No, they were not.
So how did the government clear the board to make this massive real estate offer possible in the first place?
Well, that requires looking backward. The Homestead Act of 1862 is inextricably linked to a much darker piece of legislation passed 3 decades earlier.
The Indian Removal Act.
Right, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson.
And Jackson sold this to the public as a quote-unquote voluntary relocation program. But the historical record makes it very clear this was systematic, forced expulsion.
Entirely forced.
Over the course of the 1820s through the 1840s, the military forcibly relocated tribes, including the Cherokee, Seminole, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek. They were marched from their ancestral lands in the southeast to government-designated reservations west of the Mississippi River.
And this mass exodus became known as the Trail of Tears. The conditions were just horrific. It resulted in thousands of deaths from exposure, starvation, and rampant disease.
It's off.
And the reservations they were forced onto were specifically designed to keep them contained and marginalized. You simply cannot have the Homestead Act without the Indian Removal Act operating as its necessary precursor.
It is an incredibly grim reality. The unfettered start that Lincoln promised settlers was directly geographically built on the despair and displacement of native populations.
Absolutely.
But the legal manipulation didn't stop with removal. Fast forward to 1887, and the government enacts a new policy offering 160 acres of tribal land to individual Native American families.
Right.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like they are just, extending the Homestead Act to Native Americans.
It does sound like that. And it was pitched to the public as a policy of assimilation, a way to help Native Americans integrate into the agrarian economy.
But what was it really?
Mechanically, it was a highly sophisticated legal loophole to shrink the reservations from the inside out.
Wait, walk me through the mechanics of that. How does giving them land actually take land away?
Okay, so Native American tribes traditionally held their reservation land communally. It belonged to the entire tribe as a whole.
Right, no individual deeds.
Exactly. The 1887 policy forced them to abandon communal ownership and adopt the European model of individual property. The government went into the reservations and assigned specific 160-acre plots to individual native families.
Okay, so they divide the land up into a grid.
Right, they grid it out.
Mm.
But here is the trick. Once every family was assigned their specific 160 acres, the government looked at all the vast empty space left over between those individual plots.
Oh, no.
Because it was no longer owned communally by the tribe, the government legally classified all that remaining land as surplus.
Oh, that is insidious. They forced them into a grid system, declared the empty squares extra, and then just seized it.
Exactly. They seized it and opened that surplus land up for white settlement and further homesteading.
Wow.
It was basically a mechanism to break tribal cohesion and legally strip away millions of acres of reservation land without having to actually fight a war over it.
Which is a brilliant, if, utterly cynical piece of statecraft.
Truly.
But it forces a larger question for me. This isn't just one rogue politician pushing a bad bill.
No.
This was a sustained, multi-generational effort by the entire society to bulldoze across a continent, rip up the ecology, and displace millions of native people. How did they justify this to themselves?
Well, to understand that, you really have to look at the underlying cultural and religious ideology of the 19th century.
Okay.
To the architects of westward expansion, they weren't engaging in a cynical land grab. They sincerely believed they were fulfilling a divine mandate.
And the record actually points to a very specific biblical justification for this mindset, going all the way back to Genesis, right? Chapter 1, verse 28.
That's the one.
The counsel given to Adam and Eve reads, and I have it here, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth."
That specific instruction to subdue and have dominion carried immense philosophical weight for the settlers and the government.
It was their blueprint.
It really was. It framed their entire approach to the natural world.
It's a very aggressive posture to take toward nature, though. I mean, to subdue implies that the earth is something hostile that must be beaten into submission.
But that is exactly how they viewed it. In the European-American worldview of the 1800s, caring for the earth did not mean preserving it in its natural wild state.
It meant farming it.
It meant actively manipulating it to make it agriculturally productive. If land was just sitting there with native grasses sustaining herds of buffalo, they literally viewed it as being wasted.
Because it wasn't generating a commercial yield.
Right.
So when they looked at Native American tribes living on the land without using heavy plows or fences or European-style agriculture, the settlers didn't just think they had a political right to take the land. They believed they had a moral obligation to take it.
Precisely. Bringing the steel plow to the prairie wasn't seen as ecological destruction. It was seen as fulfilling a sacred duty to bring order to chaos.
Wow.
And that ideology provided an incredibly powerful moral veneer for a process that resulted in profound human and ecological devastation. It allowed them to view the displacement of native peoples not as an atrocity, but as the unfortunate but necessary cost of divine progress.
And what is truly wild to me is how long that ideology and the legal framework of the Homestead Act itself managed to endure.
It's shocking.
Because this wasn't just a brief chapter of frontier history. The Homestead Act remained active federal law for an astonishing 114 years.
Over a century.
Yeah, it wasn't officially repealed in the lower 48 states until 1976.
And because of some specific provisions for Alaska, it actually lasted even longer up there.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the absolute final claim under the Homestead Act was approved for 80 acres in southeastern Alaska in 1988.
Let's just pause on that timeline for a second. 1988.
Yep.
We are talking about the era of MTV, the rise of the personal computer, the twilight of the Cold War.
Neon windbreakers.
Exactly. And while all of that is happening, someone in Alaska is still filling out paperwork to claim free government land based on the exact same legal mechanics signed by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War.
It completely collapses the distance between the 19th century and the modern era, doesn't it?
It really does.
We tend to view westward expansion in black and white, through the lens of old tin-type photographs of wagons and bonnets.
Yeah.
But 1988 proves that the legal architecture of that era overlaps directly with our own.
The echoes of these policies are stitched into the very recent fabric of the country.
Absolutely.
So as we process all of this today, we are left with a legacy of profound dualities. On one hand, the Homestead Act was one of the most effective equalizing forces in property law.
Without doubt.
It allowed marginalized groups, immigrants, poor families, women, freed slaves, a legitimate federally backed pathway to acquire land and build equity. It literally birthed the massive agricultural engine of the American West.
But the irrefutable flip side of that coin is that the opportunity was entirely subsidized by the systematic removal of Native American tribes.
Right.
The agrarian success of the plains was paid for by the Trail of Tears, the reservation system, and those 1887 assimilation policies. You simply cannot untangle the prosperity of one group from the displacement of the other.
It is a deeply intertwined legacy. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over that brings all these threads together.
It's a good one.
Remember that 60% failure rate we discussed earlier? Think about the descendants of the 2 out of 5 families who actually survived.
The ones who stayed.
The ones who figured out dry farming, who beat the grasshopper swarms, who endured the freezing isolation and successfully claimed their 160 acres.
They acquired a permanent generation-spanning asset.
Exactly. How much of the modern generational wealth, real estate equity, and commercial agriculture power in America today can be traced in a direct, unbroken line back to a single $10 filing fee in 1862?
The compounding interest on that initial opportunity is almost incalculable.
It's arguably one of the greatest wealth-generating mechanisms in modern history. And then consider the inverse.
Right.
How does that century of compounding wealth compare to the generational economic impact on the Native American tribes who were forcibly removed? Tribes who had their communal lands legally fractured to make that exact system possible.
That's heavy.
The echo of that $10 transaction is still ringing right now, visibly shaping both the prosperity and the poverty of the modern American landscape.
A $10 fee that quite literally bought the future, depending entirely on which side of the transaction you were forced to stand on.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you a new lens through which to view the mechanics of our past and how they built the present. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and we will catch you on the next one. Thank you for joining us for this day in His story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.